Heidi stands just outside her daughter's room, unable to step forward or walk away. Machines hum steadily on the other side of the door, keeping time she no longer trusts. Her body is present, but her thoughts have already sprinted ahead to outcomes she refuses to say aloud. Nothing is explained yet. Only urgency exists. Her attention settles on her hand. She is gripping her phone so tightly that her fingers ache. It feels heavier than it should, as if the weight comes not from the device, but from what it might demand of her. She checks the screen again, even though nothing has changed. One name sits there, untouched. The space between her breaths grows uncomfortable. The doctor's words return, not as explanations, but as consequences. Time matters. Options are thin. The solution exists, but it doesn't live in medicine alone. It lives inside a truth. Heidi made a decision about long ago, a truth she sealed and carried forward without looking back. Her thoughts do not drift into memories. They return instead to a promise she once made to herself. A firm, quiet vow never to involve him. The reason isn't explained yet, only the certainty she once felt. At the time, silence seemed like protection. Now it feels dangerously close to something else. Inside the room, Stormy shifts in her bed. She doesn't cry. She doesn't complain. She watches the ceiling with the patience children shouldn't need to learn. That calm presses harder on Heidi's chest than fear ever could. She watches her daughter through the glass and understands how unfair bravery can be. Stormy turns her head and looks toward the door, her eyes finding her mother's without effort. No words pass between them, yet something settles heavily in the space they share. Heidi knows this moment will divide her daughter's life into a before and an after, even if Stormy doesn't yet have the language for it. The doctor's voice returns again, not quoted, but felt. What Stormy needs is rare, not easily found, not something effort alone can secure, not something influence can guarantee. Heidi understands now that possibility has narrowed to a single direction. Her thoughts finally allow him in, not as the man he was when they last stood facing each other, but as the man he became after she walked away. Powerful, controlled, a man whose life grew loud while this secret stayed quiet, a man who has no idea that a child carries his eyes. This moment has nothing to do with pride, or old hurt, or maintaining distance. It has everything to do with whether telling the truth late can still mean choosing what's right, whether protecting someone in the past can endanger someone in the present. Heidi imagines the instant he answers the phone, the silence that will follow, the questions that won't come out cleanly, the realization arriving without warning. She knows that once she presses that button, nothing will return to how it was. Some doors don't allow hesitation. Have you ever carried something so heavy that it changed the way you breathe? Something meant to guard the people you loved, only to discover it might now harm them. The story makes a quiet promise. One phone call is about to collide two lives that move forward separately for years. One belongs to a child who needs more than hope. The other belongs to a man about to learn that his absence was never emptiness. A single question settles over everything that follows. What happens when truth arrives too late to be gentle, but right on time to save a life? Heidi's thumb hovers above the screen. Her breathing slows, not because she is calm, but because she must be precise. She speaks her daughter's name silently, the way people speak prayers they don't expect to be answered. The hallway feels too open, too exposed. She presses the button. The ringing begins. Each tone lands with greater weight than the last. Somewhere far away, a man who believes he understands his life is seconds away from learning he never saw the full picture. Before the call is answered, the story pauses just long enough to welcome viewers into a place where choices matter, where love intersects with consequences, and where silence is never simple. You're invited to subscribe if stories that carry lessons alongside emotion are the kind that stay with you. Then the ringing continues. The elevator rose in complete silence, smooth and uninterrupted, carrying Giovanni Reingert toward the uppermost floor of his building. By the time the doors opened, the city already belonged to him. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing miles of illuminated streets below. Every tower in view was familiar. Some had his company's signature etched into their foundation. Others owed their existence to contracts he had approved without hesitation. From this height, the city seemed obedient, neatly arranged, manageable, He stepped into the space without looking around. He never needed to. This office had been designed to command attention, but no one was there to witness it now. His jacket came off first, placed carefully over the back of a chair that cost more than most people's annual rent. His cufflinks followed, set beside a tablet displaying market trends that had already bent in his favor. Everything here responded when he arrived. Everything, except the quiet. The skyline glowed beneath the darkening sky, windows reflecting ambition in endless repetition. From up here, the lives inside those buildings were reduced to patterns of light, on, off, blinking, fading. He had once believed that reaching this level would feel different, that standing above it all would come with something solid beneath his feet. Instead, the height only widened the distance between him and everything else. A soft knock came from behind him, precise and restrained. Marcus stepped in only after being acknowledged, dressed impeccably as always, posture straight but never stiff. He carried a small tablet and the calm awareness of someone who had learned how to read moods without asking questions. "Everything's finalized," Marcus said. The Singapore expansion cleared the last review. The board is satisfied. Giovanni nodded once, eyes still fixed on the skyline. They usually are. Marcus hesitated, just long enough to show he knew better than to fill silence too quickly. "You've been here late again," he added carefully. "They're all late," Giovanni replied. His voice was even, unbothered, practiced. It was the same tone investors trusted, the one that kept uncertainty at bay. Marcus said nothing more about it. He'd learned over time that success did not protect a person from exhaustion, it only disguised it better. "Will you need anything else tonight?" Giovanni turned away from the glass at last. "No, you should go." Marcus nodded and left without comment, the door closing softly behind him. The room seemed larger once he was alone again. Not emptier, just larger. Giovanni returned to his desk, scanning documents without truly reading them. Projections, acquisitions, forecasts extending years into the future. He could see outcomes before others finished explaining them. That had become his advantage. His control over variables was precise, almost effortless. Yet when the screens dimmed and the numbers settled, nothing followed. No sense of arrival, no satisfaction, just another completed task in an endless line. This was how most nights ended. Work concluded, decisions finalized, silence waiting patiently afterward. He loosened his tie and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling as if answers might be etched there. Relationships had come and gone over the years, brief connections shaped around his schedule, never his presence. They ended quietly, often with understanding that felt more like resignation. He was always respected, rarely missed. His phone vibrated on the desk. Not a call, just a reminder for a meeting already etched into memory. He dismissed it without looking, then noticed a reflection of his own face in the glass surface, focused, controlled, unmoved. A face built for confidence, not comfort. Without intending to, his hand reached for the small drawer beside the desk. It opened with familiarity. Inside were things that didn't belong to the life he displayed. An old photograph folded carefully along its creases, a ticket stub from a forgotten evening, a note written in handwriting softer than this room allowed. He lingered over none of it for long, yet never removed them either. Her name surfaced without effort, Heidi. It did not arrive with pain anymore, just awareness. Like noticing an old scar you no longer touch but never forget. She existed in the spaces between his achievements, untouched by time in a way nothing else had managed. He never spoke her name aloud. Marcus had never heard it. Neither had anyone who contributed to the image he maintained so carefully. He stood again and walked closer to the glass, watching traffic flow far below. Somewhere in that movement were paths not taken, choices delayed until they no longer recognized him. She had known him before this version existed, before efficiency replaced curiosity, before ambition crowded out stillness. Back then his silence had been temporary, or so he told himself. Business had felt urgent, growth essential, time infinite. Years had proven otherwise. A quiet ache settled beneath his ribs, familiar but unwelcome. He didn't name it loneliness. He preferred subtler terms: focus, responsibility, sacrifice. Words that implied purpose. Yet standing here, surrounded by proof of success, he could no longer ignore the imbalance. He commanded outcomes everywhere except the place that mattered most. Marcus would return tomorrow. So would the meetings, the decisions, the expectations. The city would still stretch beneath him, waiting for instructions. Externally, nothing was missing. Internally, something remained untouched, unresolved, alive in silence. And though he did not know it yet, that silence was already on borrowed time. The gala was smaller than most people expected. No cameras lined the walls. No speeches competed for attention. The room belonged to volunteers, donors, and people who believed impact didn't need an audience. Tables were neatly arranged, glasses already filled, laughter scattered without performance. Giovanni hadn't planned to stay long. He had been invited through a junior partner who insisted it mattered. At the time, Giovanni saw it as an obligation, another appearance to check off before returning to work. That was when Heidi walked past him with a box of programs balanced against her hip, her hair tied back in a loose knot that suggested she hadn't stood in front of a mirror too long. She stopped abruptly when she realized she'd blocked his path. "Oh, sorry," she said, adjusting her grip. "I wasn't watching where I was going." He glanced at the printed title on the box. "Children's Literacy Fund?" "Yes," she replied. "First big fundraiser they've done this year. You seem invested." Her smile came easily. "I am." That was it. Nothing dramatic. No immediate pull. Just an exchange that felt lighter than the rest of the room. Later she found him again, this time handing him a drink. "You look like you'd rather be somewhere else," she teased, not unkindly. "And you look like you actually want to be here," he answered. "I do," she said simply. "Someone has to believe small things still matter." He didn't respond right away, not because he lacked words, but because something about her certainty slowed him down. For the first time that night, he stayed where he was. They talked in fragments at first, not resumes or achievements, not goals mapped 5 years ahead. Heidi told him how the program helped children read without fear of being behind. She spoke about seeing confidence change the way kids walked out of a room. Giovanni listened, surprised at how fully engaged he felt without needing to prove anything. She didn't ask what he did for a living until much later, and when he told her, she shrugged. "That sounds important," she said, "but are you happy doing it?" The question was casual, not interrogative. Still, it landed harder than anything else he'd heard that evening. "I think I'm supposed to be," he replied. "That's not the same thing," she said gently. He laughed then, short and quiet. "You ask uncomfortable questions." "I volunteer with kids," she replied. "You learn not to avoid them." They sat together long after the event ended, stacked chairs becoming the background of a conversation that wandered freely. She didn't rush him. He didn't check his watch. For once, time felt cooperative. When they parted, it was without expectation, no promises, just an awareness that something ordinary had felt rare. Their relationship didn't arrive loudly. It grew in spaces most people overlooked. Morning coffee before work because she insisted the cafe across the street made it better. Texts that carried no urgency. Evenings spent walking instead of planning. When schedules clashed, they adjusted without resentment. Heidi didn't admire his drive the way others did. She understood it, but she didn't center it. What drew her was the version of him that emerged when ambition loosened its grip, the man who listened fully, who asked why as often as how, who sat cross-legged on her living room floor helping her sort donated books because it mattered to her. One night, stretched out beside each other with the window cracked open, she studied him quietly. "You scare people sometimes," she said, not accusing, just observant. He turned toward her. "You scared?" "Never," she replied. "Just concerned." "About what?" "That you're always moving, forward so fast you might forget how to feel." He didn't answer immediately. He kissed her instead, slow and deliberate, as if choosing presence over reply. In that moment, both felt like the same thing. Giovanni became someone else around her, not weaker, just less guarded. He laughed more easily, slept better, ate meals without distraction. She learned the rhythm of his focus, when to challenge him and when to let him think in silence. They didn't need grand declarations. He fixed her leaky faucet without complaint. She brought soup when he worked late. He remembered how she took her coffee. She learned when he needed space after difficult meetings. Their closeness rested on knowing rather than insistence. Once, during a weekend trip that involved no itinerary, She caught him staring out over a quiet street, thoughtful but unburdened. "You look different," she said. "How so? Like you're not bracing for the next thing?" He considered that. "Maybe I don't feel like I need to." That frightened her a little, and thrilled her more. For a time his ambition softened, not abandoned, just balanced. He delayed meetings when they interfered with promises. He let projects simmer instead of forcing conclusions. With Heidi, the future didn't feel like something to conquer. It felt like something unfolding. She believed in his potential without demanding proof. That was new for him. Others admired results. Heidi saw the person beneath them. He admired her resolve. She lived modestly, content with purpose over expansion. When she spoke about the children she helped, her voice carried conviction without desperation. She didn't ask him to change. She invited him to notice. "I don't think success is bad," she told him once. "I just don't think it works. It replaces everything else." He nodded, even though the thought unsettled him. Still, he listened. There were disagreements, of course. Moments where they clashed. Moments where his pace overwhelmed her or her steadiness frustrated him. But they talked them through. They didn't score points. They didn't threaten distance. They trusted repair. In quiet hours, she shared stories from her childhood. He spoke of his early drives, the need to matter, the fear of falling behind. She held those truths carefully, never using them against him. "You don't have to outrun everything," she told him one night, tracing circles on his hand. "I've always known one speed," he replied. She smiled softly. "Then maybe you just haven't learned the others yet." That season of his life held a simplicity he wouldn't recognize until much later. At the time, it felt natural, fragile only in hindsight. He believed love could coexist with ambition without loss. She believed patience could protect what they were building. Neither could see how pressure would test them, but for a while, before armor hardened and choices narrowed, love asked for nothing complicated. Just presence, just honesty, just the courage to stay. And during that time, they were enough, for each other, and for themselves. Mornings became theirs before either realized it had happened. Not because they planned it, but because patterns formed quietly when no one was watching. Heidi woke earlier than Giovanni most days, moving through her small apartment without urgency. She liked the stillness before the city fully woke. By the time he stirred, the scent of coffee usually reached him first. She didn't announce herself when she entered the room, didn't ask if he wanted anything. She already knew. He watched her from the doorway sometimes, the way she leaned against the counter while waiting for water to boil, how she checked the window as if greeting the day before allowing it inside. It calmed him more than sleep ever had. These moments asked nothing of him, no decisions, no strategies, just presence. When they sat together at the table, knees brushing, conversation stayed light. News, people they'd seen, plans that didn't demand certainty. When they parted for work, it was without tension. No fear that distance meant erosion. What surprised Giovanni most was how much he missed these simple hours when they didn't happen. As weeks turned into months, they spoke more freely about what lay ahead, not in rigid timelines, but in shared imagination. Heidi once admitted she wanted to open a permanent learning center someday, a place that didn't rely on short-term funding or public attention. She described it casually, as if it were an idea still borrowing space, not a demand on reality. Giovanni listened without interrupting. He didn't offer solutions. He asked questions. How big? Where? Why that neighborhood? She answered without defensiveness, grateful that curiosity had replaced correction. In return, he spoke about growth, not as an endpoint, but as a responsibility. He described the kind of company he wanted to lead, one that lasted because it didn't hollow itself out chasing more. He wasn't used to speaking that way. It felt unguarded. Heidi didn't challenge him. She believed him. Their dreams didn't overlap completely, but they didn't conflict either. They allowed room for each other, and that felt like alignment. Heidi noticed things others never had, how Giovanni deflected praise instead of absorbing it, how he measured his worth by momentum instead of meaning. She didn't confront those habits directly. She asked questions that invited reflection. One evening, when he canceled a quiet dinner because a meeting ran longer than expected, she didn't argue. She simply asked, "Did it have to happen tonight?" He opened his mouth to justify it, then stopped. The answer wasn't clear. Another time she pointed out how rarely he rested without guilt, You don't stop because you're tired, she said softly. You stop because something else forces you to. That unsettled him, not because she was wrong, but because she wasn't afraid to see him clearly. Her care wasn't blind, it was attentive. The more time they spent together, the more Giovanni felt parts of himself loosen. He laughed without checking volume. He slept without setting alarms. He answered emails slower, not because he had less discipline, but because urgency no longer dictated worth. Heidi watched this shift with both hope and caution. She knew life had a way of testing what felt stable. Still, she didn't rush to protect what they were building. She believed it needed to breathe. One night, lying side by side with city sounds drifting in through the window, she studied the curve of his profile. "You're changing," she said. "I am?" he asked. "Yes, you're softer." He smiled faintly. "Is that bad?" "No," she replied. "I just don't want the world to harden you again." He rolled onto his side, facing her fully. "You think it will?" "The world always tries," she said. "That doesn't mean it always wins." It was during one of those quiet evenings that she said the words that stayed with him long after. They weren't arguing. They weren't celebrating. They were simply talking about the future, about effort, about what it costs to keep moving forward. Just, "Don't forget how to feel," she said gently. He looked at her, puzzled. "I think I know how. Right now you do," Heidi replied. "I'm talking about later, when things get loud again." He reached for her hand. "I won't." She smiled, but there was a softness to it that carried awareness. "Promise me you'll notice when you stop." He meant it when he agreed. He truly did. And here, the story pauses briefly, not to explain but to ask. Have you ever loved someone before the world changed them? Before pressure sharpened edges and choices narrowed into obligations? Before silence replaced conversations that once came easily? That version of love doesn't disappear all at once. It fades gradually, often unnoticed, until one day you realize you're holding memories instead of moments. Giovanni and Heidi were still in that earlier version then, the one built on ease, on attention, on believing time was patient. Neither of them saw how soon they would be tested. But for now, love was growing quietly, rooted not in grand declarations, but in mornings, shared dreams, and the courage to see each other clearly. And that made what came later unbearable to lose. At first, the changes were small enough to excuse. A dinner pushed later, a call returned shorter than promised. Heidi noticed them but didn't react. She understood momentum. She understood opportunity. When Giovanni sent messages apologizing for running behind, she replied with patience she believed would hold. The table would already be set when the door finally opened. Food still warm, conversation still available. Some nights he arrived smiling, relieved to be home. Other nights he carried the day with him, eyes distant, thoughts already reaching ahead. Heidi told herself this was temporary, that pressure was seasonal, that love could stretch without thinning. Giovanni believed the same thing. He told himself presence mattered, even as urgency demanded adjustments. Every delay felt justified, every compromise felt brief. He didn't hear absence yet, only effort. As weeks passed, dinners cooled more often than they were shared. The mugs Heidi poured sat untouched long enough for their warmth to fade. She stopped reheating them halfway through conversations, not out of resentment, out of realism. She learned to listen to the elevator before checking the time, learned the sound of his footsteps well enough to recognize exhaustion before he spoke. They spoke less about projects and more about logistics. What time? Which night? How late? Plans became softer, easier to move aside. He would ask if she minded. She would say no. Both believed they were protecting the other. Neither realized what was being traded away. Giovanni felt stretched but necessary. Heidi felt flexible but unseen. Neither labeled it that way. The silence between them began filling space where closeness once lived. Conversations shortened without intention. Pauses grew longer. When she spoke, he listened, but sometimes too late to notice what she was really saying. She didn't accuse him. She asked questions. "Do you know when you'll be free next week?" "I think so." "That's not the same thing," she said gently. He would smile, promise certainty soon, then return to whatever demanded him next. The gap between what he meant and what she needed widened slowly. Neither felt wrong. Each felt misunderstood. The night everything shifted arrived without warning. Heidi had cooked. Nothing elaborate. Something familiar. She'd set out 2 plates and waited longer than she meant to. When the message came, apologetic, brief, she didn't respond right away. By the time Giovanni walked through the door, the food sat untouched. "I didn't think you'd wait," he said carefully. "I didn't plan to," she replied. They stood across from each other, neither angry, both tired. It wasn't the missed meal that hurt. It was how ordinary the disappointment felt, how expected. "I feel like I'm losing you," Heidi said quietly. He frowned, confused. "You're not. I don't need your success," she continued. "I need you." He opened his mouth to answer, and didn't. Not because he didn't care, because he needed a moment to organize everything colliding inside him. Pressure, responsibility, fear of falling behind, fear of promising what he wasn't certain he could deliver. That pause lasted only seconds. It was long enough. Heidi saw the hesitation immediately, not as rejection, but as distance. Something inside her steadied in response, the way people do when they prepare for disappointment. "I think we want different things right now," she said. Giovanni shook his head. "That's not true." "Then say it," she replied. He couldn't. Not yet. He wanted to respond correctly, thoughtfully, with assurance that wouldn't dissolve later. He believed waiting was wiser than speaking half-formed promises. But wisdom came too slowly. The argument that followed wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no cruelty, just words missing their mark, landing beside the truth instead of on it. Heidi wasn't asking him to abandon his drive. She was asking him to choose presence as intentionally as progress. Giovanni heard an ultimatum where none was offered. When she said she felt alone, he heard blame. When he said he was trying, she heard distance. Timing slipped out of sync. Meaning fell through gaps neither noticed until it was too late. Eventually, the conversation ended not with resolution, but exhaustion. "I can't keep waiting for space that never arrives," Heidi said. Giovanni said nothing, not because he agreed, but because he didn't know how to stop what he had already set in motion. She left not long after, quietly, without spectacle. No slammed doors, no dramatic goodbye, just a final look, steady and sad, as if committing his face to memory rather than anger. Giovanni watched her go, convinced time would soften the edge, that progress would clear room to fix what had cracked. He told himself he needed only to succeed a little more, then return fully. But love doesn't wait for the right moment indefinitely. Sometimes it asks to be chosen when timing feels least convenient. That night, everything broke not because of malice or failure, but because silence arrived where certainty was needed, and neither of them knew how much that delay would cost. Heidi learned the truth on a quiet morning she hadn't prepared for. The apartment was still, sunlight resting gently along the edge of the kitchen counter. She had been tired for days, attributing it to the emotional weight she was still carrying after leaving Giovanni. Sleep felt shallow. Food tasted different. Her body moved with an unfamiliar hesitation. She hadn't planned to take the test that morning. She hadn't even allowed herself to wonder too deeply. But something inside her asked for certainty, and once that request formed, it would not loosen its hold. The result came quickly, too quickly. She sat on the edge of the tub with the small object balanced carefully in her hand, eyes fixed, breath suspended. When understanding finally arrived, it did not rush. It settled, heavy and undeniable. Her first instinct was not panic, it was stillness. "I'm going to be a mother," she whispered into the empty space, testing the weight of the sentence. Her palms rested against her thighs, as if grounding herself mattered. Tears came later, so did fear. But in that moment, the truth stood alone, asking nothing and demanding everything. The days that followed unfolded in fragments. Heidi went to work. She answered emails. She smiled when required. Outwardly, life continued. Internally, a quiet reckoning took place. She imagined telling him, heard his voice in her mind. The surprise, the questions that would follow. She imagined his life as she'd last seen it, accelerating, expanding, tightening, around expectations she no longer belonged to. She pictured how news like this would land, not gently, but like an interruption. You don't disrupt someone's life with news they didn't ask for, she told herself late one night, sitting alone on the couch. But another voice answered, back, softer yet persistent. You don't erase someone's child either. That argument carried on silently, day after day. two truths circling each other without resolution. Heidi placed a hand against her stomach each morning before leaving the apartment, a ritual that belonged only to her. The future arrived in private gestures, doctor visits taken alone, information absorbed quietly, choices weighed without consultation. Strength came in the form of routines. Fear followed her into sleep. She read deeply, not because she needed to know everything, but because knowledge steadied her. Still, no amount of preparation answered the central question. Should she tell him? She imagined his face again, not angry, not cruel, but colliding with a responsibility he hadn't planned for, a life altered without consent. She knew Giovanni well enough to understand that he would not walk away, but she also knew what his presence would demand, how it would reshape everything she had begun to rebuild. And then there was herself, the woman who had walked away because space had grown scarce, the woman who believed she could stand on her own, the woman now responsible for protecting someone who did not yet exist in the world, but already depended on her entirely. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the window, Heidi spoke the decision aloud for the first time, not to anyone else, just to the room. I won't disrupt his destiny. The words surprised her with their certainty. They didn't feel bitter, they felt final. She listed her reasons carefully, as if clarity depended on logic. He was building something vast. His life carried responsibility that extended far beyond personal choices. Introducing a child would not be simple. It would be seismic. She would not become an obligation he'd never agreed to. She would not tether him to a life he no longer shared with her. Silence, she decided, would be her way of loving everyone involved, including him, including the child. Time moved forward with or without approval. Her body changed gradually, then unmistakably. Heidi adjusted her life with deliberate care. She moved to a smaller place closer to work. She leaned into community. She let people help in ways that didn't involve explanations. She spoke to the child as if being heard already mattered. In quiet moments, she confessed fears and made promises. I've got you, she whispered more than once. No matter what, there were nights when doubt rose sharply, when the urge to reach for her phone returned fierce and unrelenting. On those nights, she reminded herself that choosing silence was not the same as choosing absence. She would be present. She would be enough. And sometimes she believed it fully. Before the story moves forward, it pauses gently and turns outward. Do you believe some secrets are acts of love or acts of fear? There are choices that shield and choices that isolate. Sometimes they look identical from the outside. Sometimes only time reveals the cost. For Heidi, holding the truth felt like carrying both hope and weight in the same breath. She did not see herself as brave. She saw herself as responsible. The future remained unwritten, the consequences unseen. But in that season of her life, she believed silence was the kindest answer she could give. And so she carried the secret forward alone, not knowing that love, once hidden, never stays quiet forever. The labor began while the sky outside darkened, clouds gathering with quiet insistence. By the time Heidi reached the hospital, rain pressed against the windows in steady waves, each burst of sound filling the spaces between her breathing. She had come alone, not because she lacked support, but because this moment felt singular, hers. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else she couldn't name, anticipation perhaps. As contractions settled into rhythm, thunder rolled in the distance, not violent but persistent. The timing felt deliberate, as though the world itself had chosen to mark this entrance. Heidi focused on the rise and fall of her chest, anchoring herself in the moment. Fear visited briefly, then passed. Purpose took its place. When the final push came, the storm outside broke fully. Rain struck the windows hard, drumming with an energy that matched the room. Then a cry pierced through it all, clear, strong, immediate. The sound grounded everything. They placed her in Heidi's arms while the rain continued its steady descent. The warmth of her daughter's body startled her with its certainty. Small fingers curled instinctively, finding purchase where none had been taught. Heidi held her close, breath uneven, heart full in a way she hadn't known before. You're stronger than the noise, she whispered, pressing her forehead gently against the child's. The room felt smaller now, bent inward by connection. Nurses moved quietly, time slowed, the storm outside gradually softened, but but the imprint of its presence remained. Heidi studied her daughter's face carefully, noting the shape of her eyes, the calm focus behind them. There it was, something familiar she couldn't entirely place. It stirred both recognition and resolve. In that moment, the world outside the room faded into irrelevance. Naming her did not come with hesitation. Heidi had thought through many names over the months, weighed meanings, tested them in silence. None had felt complete until now. "Stormy," she said softly. The word carried weight and grace at once, power without threat, movement without chaos. It felt earned. "This world will be loud," Heidi continued, as if the tiny person in her arms could already understand, "but you'll know how to stand in it." Stormy shifted slightly, brow relaxing, as though the promise had found its place. Heidi smiled through exhaustion. The name felt like an acknowledgement, not just of the timing of her arrival, but of the resilience she would carry. The days that followed blurred into new rhythms, feedings at odd hours, learning the difference between cries, discovering how little sleep a body could survive on when love insisted otherwise. Heidi moved through each moment with careful attention, amazed by how instinct filled the gaps preparation couldn't reach. Stormy slept best when held close, her breathing steadied against Heidi's chest, a reminder of how connected they were. Heidi learned to listen for each small change, each cue. In quiet hours, she spoke to her daughter about the world, not as instruction, as reassurance. She talked while preparing bottles, while rocking her gently, while sunlight crept across the floor in the mornings. There were moments of fatigue so deep they surprised her, moments of fear whispered late at night, but none outweighed the clarity that followed them. This was her purpose now, undivided, absolute. As Stormy grew, small resemblances emerged, expressions that lingered just long enough to be noticed. The tilt of her head, the way her eyes seemed to study rather than glance. Heidi saw these traits clearly and acknowledged them without flinching. Stormy was more than a symbol of the past or a bridge to what might come. She was a beginning in her own right. Heidi held her one evening as the wind moved gently against the windows, quieter now, distant. She pressed a kiss to her daughter's temple and exhaled fully. Their life would not be simple, but it would be honest. And though Stormy did not yet know it, her presence had already begun rewriting a story that silence could only delay, not prevent. Stormy learned to ask questions early, not the loud kind that demanded attention, but the thoughtful kind that paused a room. By the time she was 4, curiosity shaped the way she moved through the world. She noticed patterns. She noticed who attended school events and who didn't. She noticed the spaces where explanations were shorter. The question arrived one evening without ceremony. They were folding laundry together, Stormy carefully pairing socks with exaggerated seriousness. "Mom," she said, not looking up, "where's my daddy?" The room did not change, but Heidi felt something close around her ribs. She kept her hands moving, breath steady, as if the question had been expected. In many ways it had been. She had simply hoped for more time. She set a folded shirt aside before answering, choosing calm over speed. "He's someone who loved me once," she said. Stormy considered this. "Do you still talk to him?" "No," Heidi replied gently. "Why not?" "Because sometimes people don't stay in each other's lives," she said, shaping the words carefully, "even when the story mattered." Stormy nodded, absorbing the information without protest, but the question had taken root. As Stormy grew, the questions returned, never accusatory, always searching. At school conferences, she noticed patterns among her classmates. At friends' houses, she observed dynamic differences without comment. At home, she listened closely to what was said and what was left open. "Did my daddy like books?" she asked one morning while Heidi packed her lunch. "I think he did," Heidi answered. "Was he tall?" "Yes." "Did he laugh a lot?" Heidi hesitated, then smiled softly. Sometimes, when something really mattered to him, that answer stayed with Stormy, not because it satisfied her, but because it invited more wondering. Heidi made it a priority never to speak poorly about the man she had chosen not to name. That choice required discipline. Some days, truth pressed against her with urgency. Other days, silence felt like shelter. She continued to believe she was doing the right thing, even as the cost of that belief slowly surfaced. There were nights Stormy asked questions she didn't yet have words for. "Am I like you?" she once asked while brushing her teeth. "Yes," Heidi said. Am I like him too? Heidi paused, then nodded. Probably. Stormy looked relieved. I thought so. She seemed pleased by the idea that she belonged to something larger than what she could see. Heidi watched her closely in those moments, aware that children sense absence not as loss, but as possibility waiting to be filled. Stormy never seemed angry. She never demanded answers Heidi couldn't give. Instead, she learned to read tone, timing, expression. She understood when a subject closed and when it might open again later. Silence, Heidi realized, was teaching her daughter how to listen. At 7, Stormy began to form her own conclusions. They weren't dramatic. They were quiet observations she shared sparingly, as if testing how much truth the world could hold. Everyone has 2 parents, she said once, sitting beside Heidi on the couch. Some of them just don't live in the same place. That's true, Heidi replied. Mine lives far away, Stormy continued, more statement than question. Heidi could have corrected her. She didn't. Distance took many forms. Stormy tilted her head slightly. I think he doesn't know about me. The words landed softly but with precision. Heidi turned to her daughter fully. Why do you think that? Stormy shrugged. Because if he knew, he'd want to know me. There was no accusation in her voice, just logic. Heidi held her close, heart heavy with the clarity children sometimes carry. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't make sense until later, she said. Stormy nodded slowly. Then later must be important. Time continued, as it always does. Heidi remained steady, consistent, present. She attended every event. She learned what made Stormy laugh hardest. She showed up. And yet the questions didn't disappear. They matured. Silence stretched across years, not sharply but persistently. It asked Heidi whether protection could eventually become confinement, whether strength could become separation, whether love, kept hidden too long, asked to be known. One night, after Stormy had fallen asleep, Heidi stood in the doorway watching her breathe. The child's face rested in peaceful rest, features relaxed, unaware of the truths waiting ahead. Heidi felt pride, devotion, and something close to regret woven together inside her. She had chosen silence to protect them both, but as Stormy grew older, Heidi began to understand that silence does not remain neutral. Over time, it asks a price, and the questions, never angry, never loud, were beginning to ask for answers she could no longer avoid forever. Giovanni's relationships after Heidi shared a common pattern. They began with promise and ended with understanding that never quite reached clarity. He met women who admired him, who were comfortable in rooms shaped by success, who understood the demands of his time without resenting it, at least at first. They attended events together. They traveled when schedules allowed. They spoke about balance with optimism. But something always thinned between them. He showed up consistently in the ways that could be measured. Dinners reserved, gifts chosen carefully, time planned well in advance. What he could not offer, despite intention, was ease. There was always a sense that something in him remained elsewhere, quietly occupied. Conversations faltered at emotional edges. Affection cooled where closeness asked for stillness. When these relationships ended, they did so gently. There were no accusations, just shared recognition that something essential was missing. Giovanni accepted these conclusions with outward calm. He told himself compatibility mattered, timing mattered. He did not yet admit that absence had a shape, and it followed him. Alone at night, the city pressing softly against the windows of whatever apartment or hotel room he occupied that week, Giovanni found himself drifting into thoughts he rarely allowed space for during the day. Not specific moments, not arguments, just a presence he had once known. Heidi's name tugged at him during quiet breaks between obligations. He remembered her laughter without hearing it, recalled how she listened without needing to fix. These were not memories he actively revisited. They appeared without invitation, often when he least expected them. One evening, after another engagement ended with polite goodbyes, he poured a drink and stood by the window, staring at traffic far below. He wondered briefly whether something would have shifted if he'd paused longer back then, if one sentence delivered sooner could have changed years that followed. He dismissed the thought as indulgent, yet it returned. In a rarely used drawer, tucked behind files no longer relevant, Giovanni kept remnants of a life he no longer lived. He didn't open it often. When he did, it was without ceremony, a photograph worn at the edges from being folded and smoothed too many times. Heidi stood mid-laugh, unaware of the moment being captured. It had been taken during an unremarkable afternoon. That ordinariness now felt precious in ways he hadn't understood then. There was also a ticket stub from a local show they'd attended spontaneously. No notes, no grand framing, just proof that time once belonged to them in a way it never did again. He held these items carefully, not out of longing, but acknowledgement. Something existed once that could not be recreated by achievement or reach. He returned them to the drawer as he always did, neatly, as if respect demanded restraint. The regret Giovanni carried did not come with a clear cause. That made it harder to resolve. He couldn't locate a single failure or event to correct. The ending had been subtle. A few pauses too long, a few answers delivered too late. He asked himself questions he never voiced aloud. What if I had stayed that night? What if I'd chosen presence when it felt inconvenient? What if success could have waited? These questions were not accusations. They arrived alongside understanding of who he was then. Ambitious, driven, believing responsibility demanded sacrifice. He had not acted out of malice. He had acted out of momentum. Still, outcomes did not care about intention. The realization that timing can matter as much as truth settled into him slowly. Years passed. His life expanded outward, contracts signed, projects completed, recognition earned. Public confidence remained intact. Inside, something stayed unfinished. He noticed it most during solitary moments, when achievement no longer competed for his attention. He noticed it in the quiet after applause faded, in the subtle relief of canceled plans, in the hesitation before forming attachments that might ask more of him than he could offer. He did not label the feeling as loneliness. He told himself it was reflection, growth, perspective. But some nights, when the city slept and there was nothing left to manage, he admitted it quietly. There was a version of his life that ended without closure, and though he did not yet know what silence had been protecting, or what it had been costing, he felt certain of one thing: something important had been left behind, and the absence of it had shaped him more than success ever did. Stormy's fatigue arrived quietly. At first, Heidi attributed it to growth, to long days at school, to the natural ebb and flow of a child's energy. Stormy was still curious, still warm, still smiling in the ways that mattered. She only asked to sit down more often. She moved a little slower on walks they once took with ease. Then came the bruises. Small at first, in places that didn't make sense. Stormy couldn't always remember how they happened. Heidi noticed how often she rubbed her arms, how she leaned more heavily against counters, how her sleep deepened but never refreshed her. "You feeling okay?" Heidi asked one morning. "I'm just tired," Stormy replied, unconcerned. That answer held for a while, until it didn't. Doctor visits replaced afternoons at the park. Blood tests replaced playdates. Heidi kept her voice light through each appointment, careful not to let concern shape her expressions. Stormy watched everything closely, absorbing cues even when no explanations followed. The results came back slowly, each one eliminating simple answers. Fatigue became persistent. The bruises darkened. Stormy stopped finishing meals she once enjoyed. Heidi's instinct sharpened. She read, asked questions, tracked changes. She began waking in the night, listening for small sounds that told her Stormy was resting comfortably. When reassurances came, she accepted them, but she remained alert. Silence crept in again, different this time, heavier, less forgiving. The day the doctor asked them to sit felt different. The room was quiet, orderly, neutral in a way that offered neither kindness nor cruelty. Heidi sat beside Stormy, her arm resting protectively along her daughter's back. The doctor spoke carefully, choosing words that were measured, not dramatic. He explained that Stormy's condition was rare, treatable, yes, but complicated. There would be more tests, monitoring, intervention. Heidi nodded, listening with attention that bordered on stillness. She asked clear questions. She did not interrupt. Stormy swung her legs lightly from the exam table, oblivious to the shift taking place above her understanding. Then the doctor paused. "There's one issue we need to address," he said. "Stormy will likely need a transfusion." Heidi felt the word land without impact. Transfusions, she knew, existed to help. She waited for reassurance. "What blood type?" she asked. The doctor hesitated just long enough for awareness to sharpen. AB negative, he said. It's extremely rare. The sentence settled into the space between them. Heidi felt her breath shallow, her thoughts compress. She knew the implications immediately. Donors would be difficult to find. Time would matter. Stormy looked up. Is that bad? It just means we need to be careful, the doctor replied gently. Heidi said nothing. The room felt smaller, as if the walls had edged inward without notice. AB negative. The knowledge resurfaced from a decade past, uninvited and exact. She had known once. She had listened carefully back then. She had not forgotten. Silence did not protect her anymore. It exposed her. As the doctor continued outlining next steps, Heidi's attention fractured. She responded when needed, nodded when required. Inside, realization took shape with unmistakable clarity. There was someone who shared that blood type, someone she had chosen not to involve. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with certainty. The choice she made years ago had not disappeared. It had waited, patiently. And now, it stood between her daughter and the help she needed. Stormy slipped her hand into Heidi's. The gesture was small, instinctive, anchoring. Is something wrong, Mom? She asked. Heidi forced a smile. No, sweetheart. We're just figuring things out. But for the first time since Stormy's birth, Heidi felt the ground shift beneath her confidence. That evening, after Stormy had fallen asleep, Heidi sat alone in the kitchen. The details of the day replayed without emotion, precise and unyielding. AB negative, rare, necessary. She opened a drawer and removed papers she hadn't touched in years. Old insurance forms, notes, a copy of information she had once studied casually when love still lived in ease. Giovanni's blood type was written there. The weight of that truth pressed against her chest, not as surprise, but as consequence. Silence had carried her this far. Now it demanded payment. For years she had believed she was protecting everyone involved. Now protection required something else entirely. Heidi rested her forehead against the table and closed her eyes. The moment she had spent a decade avoiding had arrived, not angrily, not suddenly, but with absolute clarity. And there was no way forward that did not involve the truth. Heidi waited until the hallway outside Stormy's room went quiet. The monitors inside continued their steady work, indifferent to the decision pressing against her chest. She stood near a window, city lights blurred by the glass in her own unfocused eyes. Her phone rested in her hand again, as it had earlier that day. But this time there was no hovering. The choice had already been made. All that remained was action. She scrolled once. His name appeared instantly. Her thumb paused, not from doubt, but from respect for the moment. She thought briefly of the last time they had spoken, how ordinary it had seemed then. She inhaled slowly and pressed call. The ringing began, measured even. Each sound stretched space between past and present. She waited without pacing, her body unusually still. Giovanni answered on the third ring. Hello? His voice carried the same restraint it always had. Professional, grounded, familiar in a way that cut deeper than Heidi expected. For a second she couldn't speak. She hadn't practiced this part. No script could account for how memory reacts to sound. Giovanni, she said finally. Silence settled immediately, not dropped, held. When he spoke again, the tone was different, careful, alert. Heidi? Another pause followed, heavier than the first. She imagined him standing where he was, likely surrounded by glass and quiet, his life orderly, intact. She felt the weight of what she was about to disturb, and still, she continued. I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important, she said. He didn't interrupt. That alone told her he knew the gravity had shifted. Is something wrong? He asked. She chose honesty over comfort. There's a child. The words landed and stayed there, unadorned. Giovanni drew a breath she could hear through the line. What do you mean? She's mine, Heidi said. She's 8. Time slowed. She waited for disbelief, for questions to rush in. Instead, there was restraint. Tight, deliberate. Are you saying... He stopped himself. Why are you telling me this now? She's sick, Heidi answered. Her voice did not shake. She needs a transfusion. Her blood type is rare. Another silence followed, sharper now. Controlled, but fraying at the edges. And you think I can help, he said. I know you can, she replied. Giovanni did not speak immediately. When he did, the words came evenly, as though shaped carefully to avoid shattering something unseen. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I believed I was protecting us," Heidi said. "I believed I was protecting her." "And now?" he asked. "Now protection means telling the truth," she said. "There's a child, and she needs you." The sentence stood between them. Nothing else needed to be added. He exhaled slowly. "Send me the hospital information." She did not thank him. This was not generosity. It was responsibility finding its place. "I will," she said. When the call ended, Heidi remained where she was, phone still against her ear for a moment longer than necessary. The world had not shifted, physically, but everything else had. Giovanni stayed seated long after the call disconnected. His hand rested on the desk, fingers still. The city beyond his office window continued its restless movement, unchanged by his sudden absence from it. A child, 8 years old. Details surfaced without permission. A vague memory of Heidi's timing, the distance that followed, the quiet regret he had never quite explained to himself. He stood at last, walked to the window and placed his palm against the glass. His reflection stared back, altered by information he could not yet organize. There was shock, yes, but not confusion. Something settled into alignment inside him, as if a missing piece had been named. He picked up his phone again, steady now, already shifting into motion. Back at the hospital, Heidi returned to Stormy's room. She took her place beside the bed and watched her daughter sleep, the rise and fall of her chest reassuring and fragile all at once. Stormy stirred slightly, then relaxed when Heidi brushed a hand through her hair. "I called him," Heidi whispered, though Stormy could not hear. "I told the truth." The path ahead remained uncertain. Questions crowded the edges of her thoughts, but one thing was clear now. Silence was no longer carrying the weight. The truth had been spoken, and everything that followed would grow from that moment forward. Giovanni arrived without delay or ceremony. There was no entourage, no assistant trailing behind with instructions or schedules. He signed in quietly, gave his name, and followed directions down a long corridor where voices softened and movements slowed. The walls were clean, colorless, unfamiliar. His footsteps felt louder than they should have. He stopped outside the room marked with Stormy's name. He did not go in immediately. Through the narrow window, he saw a child sitting upright on the bed, swinging her legs slightly as she spoke to a nurse. There was an ease to her posture, a calm awareness that settled into him before recognition fully formed. Heidi stood nearby, her back to him, speaking softly. She had not yet noticed him. For a brief moment, Giovanni watched without interruption, without intrusion. This was not a meeting. This was an arrival. Something pulled sharply in his chest. Not anxiety, but connection waking without warning. Heidi turned when she sensed movement. Their eyes met, and the years between them closed instantly, stripped of memory and explanation. No greeting followed. No apology attempted. The moment required neither. "You came," she said finally. "I said I would," Giovanni replied. He followed her gaze back to the room. "Is she?" "She's resting," Heidi said. "She's strong." He nodded once. Strength, he realized, had simply found a new expression. When the nurse stepped aside, Heidi opened the door fully. Giovanni crossed the threshold slowly, as if speed might fracture something delicate. The child looked up, and everything aligned. Recognition did not come as a thought. It arrived as certainty, in the shape of her eyes, the focus behind them, the way her head tilted slightly, assessing before engaging. He had seen that expression before, in the mirror years ago. Stormy studied him openly, not startled, curious. "Hi," she said. He swallowed, then answered carefully. "Hi." Her gaze moved between him and Heidi. "You look like me," she observed. A small sound escaped him, half laugh, half breath. "So I've been told," he managed. Heidi watched closely, allowing space rather than guiding it. She placed a hand on Stormy's shoulder, grounding without steering. "This is Giovanni," she said. Stormy nodded. "I like your jacket." He smiled then, genuinely, and the simplicity of it undid him more than any confrontation could have. Giovanni crouched down so they were eye level, not because it felt rehearsed, but because it felt right. He did not reach for her. He did not assume familiarity. He let the moment greet him as it chose. "I heard you're pretty brave," he said. Stormy considered this. "I get tired," she replied, "but I don't like when people worry." "I understand that," he said. And he did. She leaned closer, inspecting him with thoughtful seriousness. "Are you staying long?" "As long as they let me," he answered. She accepted this with a nod. The room felt balanced, as if it had shifted to accommodate a truth spoken aloud at last. Heidi looked away briefly, not to avoid the scene, but to steady herself within it. Tears pressed at the edges of her control, unsummoned and unannounced. She did not cry yet. She held the moment with care, the way one holds something fragile without ownership. Giovanni stood up slowly and turned to her. Their eyes met again, this time carrying more than memory. There was understanding now, weight shared. "You didn't imagine her," he said quietly. "You carried her, and you're here," she replied. "That matters. No blame passed between them, only recognition of what had been and what was now required." The nurse returned with updates, details, timelines. Giovanni listened intently, asking only what was necessary. He offered information when requested. His presence was not performative, it was immediate. When the nurse left, Stormy looked between them again. "Are you friends?" she asked. Heidi smiled gently. "We're learning." Stormy seemed satisfied with that answer. She relaxed back against her pillow, eyelids growing heavy. As she drifted, Giovanni remained where he was, still, attentive. He did not reach out again. He allowed rest to come naturally. That restraint spoke louder than declarations ever could. Later, in the hallway, Heidi and Giovanni stood side by side without urgency. The world beyond those walls waited, but neither belonged to it at this moment. "She's yours," Heidi said quietly, not as confession, as acknowledgement. "I know," Giovanni replied, "and I'm not going anywhere." There were tears then, but not dramatic, not uncontrolled, just release, a recognition of truth arriving without cruelty. They stood in silence, not as strangers, not as they once were, but as two people meeting the consequences of love long delayed. In that place, surrounded by clean walls and softened footsteps, identity settled into its rightful shape. Father, mother, child. Nothing was resolved yet. Everything had begun. The preparation room was smaller than Giovanni expected, practical, unadorned, a place designed for purpose, not recognition. He rolled up his sleeve without ceremony while the technician explained the process with the same calm tone used hundreds of times before. Consent forms were read and signed, confirmations made. Nothing about the exchange suggested who he was outside these walls. That anonymity settled him. As a needle was placed, he looked away, not from discomfort, but from an instinct to control. This moment was not about command. It was about offering something essential. Without negotiation, he focused on the steady pace of his breathing, matching it to the quiet efficiency around him. He thought briefly of contracts he had signed with pens that cost more than this entire room. None of them had carried this weight. Time slowed once the process began. The soft mechanical rhythm replaced thought. Giovanni's mind, used to problem solving, rested in stillness he rarely allowed. No decisions pressed in. No outcome needed managing. The act itself was enough. He imagined Stormy's face when she slept, how her expression softened as if she trusted the world, even when awake, had asked too much. The knowledge that what flowed from him now would reach her soon felt grounding in a way achievement never had. This was not a transaction. There was no return expected, no record needed. He remained there simply because he was required to be. For once, his presence carried no other meaning. When it was finished, the technician offered water and a light snack, routine kindness wrapped in professionalism. Giovanni thanked them quietly and sat as instructed, letting the moment conclude at its own pace. His arm felt tender, his chest felt steady. Heidi waited nearby, seated a short distance away. She hadn't watched the procedure closely. She hadn't needed to. Her awareness had stayed with him throughout, respectful and restrained. Their eyes met briefly. No words passed. None were necessary. What needed doing had been done. They sat together afterward in a shared space where voices stayed low and time seemed less urgent. Heidi folded her hands in her lap, posture composed, still carrying the tension of days that had asked too much of her strength. "Thank you," she said softly. "I should have been here sooner," he replied. The exchange settled between them, not as guilt, but responsibility acknowledged. Redemption did not announce itself. It showed up quietly in actions taken without defense. They remained seated side by side, no attempts to fill the silence. The absence of urgency felt earned. Later, as they prepared to return to Stormy's room, Giovanni paused briefly at the doorway. The world beyond still waited. Meetings postponed, systems rearranged, a life forced to adapt. He felt none of the usual resistance to that disruption. Action had replaced explanation. Presence had replaced regret. He glanced once at Heidi, who nodded almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a shared understanding. This was not resolution. It was commitment in motion. Together, they stepped forward, not toward certainty, but toward what mattered. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Stormy recovered slowly, deliberately, as if her body understood that rushing would ask too much. Each day brought small improvements that mattered more than milestones ever could. Appetite returned. Color warmed her cheeks. Laughter began to arrive unprompted again. Heidi watched these changes quietly, cataloging progress without celebrating too soon. Giovanni came when invited and stayed when welcome, never assuming space that hadn't been offered. He learned Stormy's routines through observation rather than insistence, what foods she preferred now, how she liked stories read, which questions signaled curiosity rather than fatigue. He listened more than he spoke. That, more than anything, made her comfortable. One afternoon, while drawing together at a low table near the window, Stormy glanced up from her paper and studied her parents with open curiosity. "You smile different around each other," she said. Heidi paused, crayon still in hand. Giovanni looked up more slowly. "How so?" he asked. "Not like you're trying," Stormy replied. "Just like you remember something." The statement was simple. The truth inside it wasn't. Neither adult corrected her. Children notice when effort leaves the room and something quieter replaces it. That night, after Stormy had fallen asleep, Heidi and Giovanni stood in the hallway outside her room. The shared vigilance of watching her rest had softened into familiarity. No words were exchanged at first, only presence. "She's observant," Giovanni said finally. "She always has been," Heidi replied. There was an ease to this exchange that surprised them both. Not because it echoed the past, but because it didn't try to resurrect it. The space between them felt grounded in what had already been faced. "I don't want to pretend we can just pick up where we left off," Giovanni said carefully. "I don't want that either," Heidi answered. "We're not the same people." He nodded. "But I think we're capable of becoming something honest." Heidi considered him for a long moment, not weighing words but watching actions align with them. Slowly, she said. "That's okay," he replied, and meant it. Their reconnection did not follow gestures from earlier years. There were no late-night confessions shaped by urgency, no dramatic declarations meant to erase time. Instead, there were shared meals centered around Stormy's routines, conversations built around clarity, not possibility alone. They spoke openly about mistakes without assigning fault. Heidi spoke about fear without softening it. Giovanni listened without trying to fix what could only be understood. He acknowledged the pain caused by his absence without explanation or defense. "I didn't know how to make room," he said once. "That doesn't excuse it. But I see it now." Heidi accepted the admission without relief or triumph. Understanding did not require agreement. What mattered was recognition. Some evenings they sat together after Stormy slept, not touching, simply sharing the same air. Familiarity returned gradually, but differently. Less charged, more intentional. They learned where each other stood now, not who they had once been. Healing did not declare itself complete. It continued quietly. In the way Giovanni adjusted schedules without comment, in the way Heidi allowed him into moments she had carried alone, in the way Stormy moved freely between them, without sensing tension or performance. One night, while walking back from the hospital under a calm sky, Heidi stopped and looked at Giovanni. "We grew up," she said. "He considered this, and we're still growing," he replied. They shared a small smile, not nostalgic, not hopeful in excess, just real. Their closeness no longer relied on promise or memory. It rested on consistency, presence, and care practiced daily. Love, relearned not as escape or reward, but as responsibility willingly shared. And for the first time, neither felt the need to hurry. Giovanni did not announce his return to ordinary life. He simply reorganized it. Meetings moved, travel shortened, decisions that once took precedence quietly adjusted around new priorities. He showed up at Stormy's school without drawing attention, standing just off to the side during pickup, observing before engaging. At first, Stormy watched him carefully, as children do when assessing reliability. He arrived when he said he would. He asked questions about her day and waited for real answers. He didn't rush her responses or steer them toward what he wanted to hear. When teachers spoke to him, he listened without interrupting, taking in small details that mattered more than summaries. Over time, Stormy stopped checking the entrance anxiously. She expected him now. That shift, subtle and unspoken, meant more than any verbal reassurance. He learned that consistency didn't require perfection. It required return. Evenings settled into a rhythm he did not try to control. Bedtime became a shared responsibility, not an obligation passed between adults. Giovanni learned how Stormy liked her stories, slow, with pauses, sometimes repeated lines she knew by heart. Again, she would say, when a part pleased her. He obliged without impatience. He learned when to speak and when silence worked better. Some nights, Stormy asked questions about the world. Other nights, she leaned against his shoulder without explanation. He learned not to fill those spaces. Presence, he discovered, was often quiet. Heidi watched these moments from the doorway or kitchen, never interfering, never directing. The care with which Giovanni handled his role mattered to her, not because it erased the past, but because it rewrote the future. Listening became Giovanni's most deliberate practice. He listened when Stormy spoke about friends, not brushing off small conflicts. He listened when Heidi shared concerns, not rushing toward solutions. He accepted that not every problem required resolution, only attention. One evening, Stormy asked, "Did you always know how to be a dad?" He smiled softly. "No, I'm still learning." She considered this, then nodded. "That's okay." The exchange stayed with him. It affirmed what he had begun to understand. Strength wasn't authority. It was willingness, it was patience, it was returning without resentment or expectation of reward. He stopped measuring his worth by impact and started measuring it by presence. Weeks turned into months. Progress did not arrive in leaps, but in patterns. School events attended quietly, meals shared without distraction, apologies offered without justification when needed. Giovanni did not try to reclaim lost years by compressing experience. He allowed time its role. The trust forming between him and Stormy emerged without pressure, steady and uncomplicated. One afternoon, as they walked home together, Stormy slipped her hand into his without looking. The gesture surprised him more than any milestone might have. He did not comment. He simply adjusted his stride. Showing up, he realized, wasn't about grand gestures or redemption moments. It was about repetition, about returning again and again until trust no longer questioned itself. If this part of the story has moved you, if it's reminded you of the power of consistency, presence, or second chances, this is a good moment to pause. Stories take life when they're shared. A like, a share, or a comment helps keep them alive for others who might need to hear them. For Giovanni, showing up became its own reward. Not because it healed everything, but because it established something solid where uncertainty once lived. He had learned that masculinity did not demand distance, and fatherhood did not require command. Respect showed up in listening. Love revealed itself in routine. And one evening, as Stormy fell asleep mid-story, her hand still resting lightly against his arm, Giovanni understood that redemption rarely arrives all at once. It arrives daily, in showing up, in staying, and in choosing presence again tomorrow. The balcony overlooked the city as it always had, yet it no longer felt like a place of distance. The lights below were softer now, not because they had dimmed, but because they no longer demanded anything. Heidi leaned against the railing, arms folded loosely, breathing in the cool air. From this height, the city looked less like a challenge and more like a collection of lives unfolding at their own pace. Giovanni stood beside her, neither too close nor too far. There was no need for commentary. The skyline no longer represented control or ambition. It marked time instead. Years passed, lessons learned, choices lived with. He noticed how she stood now, steadier than before, no longer bracing for the next disappointment. She had claimed her ground quietly, and it showed. "This view used to feel different," he said at last. "Yes," she replied, "it did." Neither rushed to explain why. They spoke about small things first. Stormy's school project, a book Heidi had begun reading again after years of distraction, a weekend plan that involved nothing pressing, nothing impressive. Their conversation carried no urgency, only comfort. Giovanni glanced toward the city, then back at Heidi. "I used to think standing above everything meant something," he said. "And now?" she asked. "Now I think it made me forget what standing beside someone feels like." She nodded, not surprised. "We all learn that eventually," she said. "Some of us just learn it later." No bitterness lived in the statement, only truth. Silence returned smoothly. It didn't ask to be filled. Giovanni turned toward her fully now, study replacing motion. Heidi felt the shift but didn't retreat from it. She had learned the difference between anticipation and pressure. This was neither. "What we have now," he said carefully, "it's different." "It is," she agreed. "Do you want to see where it goes?" She met his eyes. "As long as it keeps going at the pace we're walking." He smiled, small and genuine. "I can do that." He reached for her hand, not with urgency, not to claim, but to connect. She let her fingers thread through his naturally. No spark flared, no memory intruded. There was only the present, solid and real. When they kissed, it was slow and deliberate. Not the kiss of people trying to reclaim something lost, but of two adults choosing forward motion with eyes open. There was no fear in it, no escape, just acknowledgement. The city hummed below, unchanged by the moment, and yet everything for them had shifted. Growth had given the skyline new meaning, not as a measure of distance or success, but as a reminder that life continued, wide and forgiving, for those willing to meet it honestly. They stayed there a while longer, hands still joined, the future no longer something to outrun or solve. It waited patiently, as it always had, ready to meet them where they stood. And for once that was not intimidating. It was enough. Some love stories don't fail because love disappears. They fail because courage runs out before the truth arrives. In this story, love was never absent. It simply waited in silence, waiting for someone brave enough to speak, to show up, to risk discomfort in order to do what mattered most. Love is not proven by what we feel when times are gentle. It's proven by what we're willing to face when the stakes rise. Silence can look like protection. It can feel responsible. It can even feel loving. But silence, left unchecked, carries consequences of its own. Heidi believed she was shielding everyone from pain, and for a time she succeeded. But time does not erase truth. It only delays its impact. What we don't say has weight. What we avoid has a cost. And eventually silence asks to be answered. This story also reminds us that providing is not the same as being present. Giovanni built success so effectively that nothing material was missing from his life, except connection. What Stormy needed most was never money or power. She needed someone willing to sit, listen, wait, and stay. Presence cannot be outsourced. It cannot be postponed indefinitely. It must be practiced daily in ways that rarely earn applause. Truth matters, even when it arrives later than it should have. It matters because it allows healing where guessing once lived. It matters because clarity gives people a chance to choose differently going forward. Telling the truth late does not erase its value. It restores possibility. It opens doors that silence quietly sealed shut. Family, at its strongest, is not about perfection or timing or faultless decisions. It's about showing up when the story becomes complicated. It's about choosing responsibility without resentment and commitment without conditions. Family is built in the moments where staying would be easier to avoid, but someone stays anyway. Giovanni was not redeemed by wealth, apologies, or grand gestures. He was redeemed through consistency, by arriving when expected, by listening without control, by doing the ordinary work that builds trust quietly over time. Strength, this story tells us, is not dominance, it is steadiness. It is humility. It is the courage to learn roles you were never taught how to play. Heidi's strength reminds us that sacrifice and fear often wear the same face. Choosing alone does not always mean choosing wisely. True strength sometimes means letting others in, even when it risks reopening old pain. Carrying everything by yourself may feel noble, but shared truth lightens burdens silence cannot. Stormy's presence teaches us that children do not need flawless parents. They need honest ones. They need adults who return, who explain, who admit mistakes, and who choose love in visible ways. Children notice who stays. They always do. If this story stirred something in you, if one of these lessons reflected a chapter of your own life, this is your invitation. Subscribe for more stories that don't just entertain, but challenge, encourage, and remind us what really matters. And take a moment to comment below which lesson hit you the hardest. Because stories live longer when they're shared, and sometimes the one person who needs to hear this is closer than you think.